Hello and welcome to the My School channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. So we're moving on to a new topic, processes of legislation. We're going to examine how laws are enacted in a country. So please don't go anywhere. Sit back, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the My School channel. Like I said earlier, we're moving on to processes of legislation, so let's dive right into it. Alright, so in this lesson, we're going to discuss the definition and purpose of legislation. We're going to look at the different types of legislation. We have supreme legislation and delegated legislation. So in that supreme legislation, we're going to examine the two types of supreme legislation. We have statutes or acts and constitutional amendments. Then for delegated legislation, we're going to look at bylaws, orders in council, statutory instruments, provisional orders, special procedure orders, regulations, and rules. Then we're also going to examine decrees and edicts. Then we're going to move on to the legislative process. We're going to examine how laws are made in a particular country. Then we're going to discuss the concept of lobbying. So let's begin with the definition. So what is legislation? Legislation refers to laws and statutes that are enacted by a governing body, such as a national or state legislature. So when we're talking about enactments, that is the duty of a legislature. They enact laws, they make laws within the country. So legislation are those things, those laws that are made by the legislative arm of governments. So we're talking about the national or state legislature. Now let's move on to the next slide. So the common meaning of legislation is the making of a law. It is made up of the two words, legis and latum. So legis means law and latum means making. So therefore, legislation means lawmaking. So these laws are formally written and established through a structured process involving proposal, debate, amendment, and approval. So we're going to discuss these processes later on in this video lesson. So legislation can take various forms, including primary legislation, e.g. acts or statutes, and secondary or delegated legislation, e.g. regulations, orders in councils, etc. Now let's move on to the next slide. Alright, what are the purposes of legislation? Legislation plays a critical role in shaping the governance and functioning of society. So here are some of its key roles. Legislation helps in the maintenance of public order and safety. So criminal laws define unacceptable behaviors and prescribe punishment for those who violate these laws. So without this legislation, there will be no law and order within the society. You need laws for people to follow, and you need those laws to come along with punishments. It needs to prescribe punishment for those who break the law so that they can continue to maintain order within that society. Legislation also enshrines and protects fundamental human rights and freedoms, such as freedom of speech, religion, and the right to a fair trial. So without legislation, we will not be able to enshrine and protect the fundamental rights of the citizens within that society. It also mandates the provision of essential public services such as healthcare, education, and social welfare programs. We're going to be talking about delegated legislation. These are laws that are made by public corporations and ministries within the society. So these ministries are usually responsible for providing public service. And without this legislation that helps to bring these ministries into being, there will be no public service, there will be no healthcare, education, and social welfare programs that will help to make things easier for the citizens within the society. It also regulates business practices to ensure fair competition, consumer protection, and corporate accountability. That's the reason why we have a government. We need someone who is there to stand between the companies, the organizations within the society, and the people to ensure that they continue to do business with accountability, with transparency, to ensure that they continue to provide necessary service to the people within the society. So we need laws that help to protect the citizens against companies who seek to take advantage of members of the society. Then constitutional and administrative laws define the structure, powers, and functions of government institutions and officials. So without these laws that help to guide how government institutions should function, the government will not function properly. They can take advantage of the power that's been given to them to make policies that suit their own self-interest rather than the interest of the citizens that they govern. So we need those laws to help to control government institutions and public officials. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, there are two major types of legislation. We have the supreme or primary legislation, and we have the delegated or secondary legislation. So the supreme legislation refers to laws that are made by the legislature or lawmakers in the country. They are the foundational laws and statutes of a country. So in the presidential system of government, we are talking about the laws that are made by members of the National Assembly. Then in the parliamentary system, laws that are made by the parliament. They have two different systems, but they primarily make laws that the citizens and government officials should follow within that society. Then we have delegated or secondary legislation. So delegated legislation, also known as secondary or subordinate legislation, is law made by an individual body under powers given to them by an act of parliament. So this type of legislation allows for more detailed and specific provisions to be made without the need for a new act. So while these laws are made by lawmakers within this country, these laws are made by individuals or corporations that are given power by acts of parliament, by the lawmakers within the country to make certain laws. The reason why they give these individuals or organizations power to make laws within society is because the lawmakers cannot make all the laws within society because there are some technical things that need to be considered by these organizations or these individuals. So without the technical know-how, they cannot make laws based on certain situations in society. So they need these organizations, they need these individuals, they need these bodies to make these laws in their stead. So they give them the power through an act of parliament. So we're going to discuss all of this later on. And let's move on to the next slide. All right, supreme legislation. We're going to begin with the first type of legislation. It refers to laws that are made by the legislature or lawmakers in a country. So these are the foundational laws and statutes of a country. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, there are two types of supreme or primary legislation. We have acts and statutes. Acts and statutes are formal laws passed by the legislature, e.g. the parliament or Congress. So these are the highest form of law and require a rigorous process of drafting, debate, and approval. So this is the central business of the lawmakers in a country. So those people debating in the National Assembly and in the Nigerian Senate, what they are doing is making acts and statutes that guide how the country should be run. So that is their central business in the National Assembly. Then we also have constitutional amendments. This is another type of supreme legislation. So these are changes to the constitution, often requiring a special procedure, such as a supermajority in the legislature or a referendum. So if there are things within the constitution that needs to be amended, it is the duty of the lawmakers within the country, members of the Nigerian Senate and the House of Representatives. They are the ones who are responsible for making changes to the constitution. But in some countries, they also require a referendum. They also require the people within the society to make the decision as to whether certain laws within the constitution should be amended. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, we are moving on to the other type of legislation, which is delegated legislation. It is the law made by an individual or body under powers given to them by an act of parliament by the lawmakers in the society. So this type of legislation allows for more detailed and specific provisions to be made without the need for a new act. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, the volume of legislation required in modern times is so large that the parliament cannot find time to do all the detailed work involved. So this is why power has to be delegated by the legislature, which is the supreme lawmaking body in the country, to other bodies such as ministries, local governments, public corporations, etc. So the lawmakers in the country cannot make all the laws because there are so many things to legislate on in the country. So they need to delegate power to some organizations, some bodies within the government to make those laws. We discussed earlier on about how there is a growth in executive power. This is one of the reasons why there is a growth in executive power. The ministries, local government, public corporations are members of the executive. Their duty is not to make law within the society, but the legislature gives them the power to make law. So their power, in a sense, is growing. So in a way, it undermines the principle of separation of power, where each arm of government is responsible for doing certain things within the society. Legislature is meant to make laws, executive is meant to execute the law or to enforce the law, while the judiciary is meant to interpret the law. But in this case, the legislature is giving the executive some power. This is something we need to consider as we move on to other topics. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, the legislature finds it more convenient to lay down the general principles of laws and then leave the administrative and technical aspects to these other bodies whose power powers are delegated by the legislature. Usually, their regulations are made according to the terms of a statute or an act of parliament, which lays down the general terms, the subjects on which the minister is empowered to issue regulations, and the maximum penalty which the court may impose any infraction. So this is how the ministries have the power to make laws within the society. It is through an act of parliament. That act of parliament lays down the laws. It tells the ministry what subject they should make laws on. And if there is any infraction, if they disobey the laws laid down within this act of parliament, they can be sent to court and they might receive a penalty. So this is what controls the executive to prevent them from overextending the power that has been assigned to them. So it is under these regulations that we are forbidden from driving the wrong way on a one-way street, from smoking inside a bus or public space, etc. All of these laws are laws that are made by these ministries and by the executive and not by the legislature. So this is one of the reasons why the lawmakers have to delegate some of these responsibilities to the ministries. They cannot handle all of these things. They need the executive to help them in the lawmaking process as well. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, there are different types of delegated legislation. One of the types of legislation is bylaws. So these are local laws or regulations made by the local government to address issues within their jurisdiction. So there are also laws that are made by public corporations. So these laws are conferred on them through acts of parliament. So first of all, it is laws that are made by the local government. The local government is essentially part of the executive arm. They do not have lawmakers in the local governments. We only have lawmakers at the federal and the state level and not at the local level. So the local government also needs to be able to make certain laws that will help to maintain their region. And so the legislature at the federal level gives the local government the power to make certain bylaws, local laws or regulations that can help to govern that particular local government. Also, it is laws that are made by public corporations. When we're talking about public corporations, we're talking about those corporations that maintain the public services we have, such as healthcare, education, water, electricity, and the likes. Now, let's move on to that type of delegated legislation. We have orders in council. So orders in council are types of legislation made by the monarch and the privy council instead of parliaments. So these orders are approved in person by the monarch. Orders in council are issued by the sovereign on the advice of the Privy Council, a body that advises the crown on political and governmental issues. So this type of delegated legislation is restricted only to constitutional monarchies. It doesn't happen here in Nigeria. It is made by the Privy Council as they advise the monarch on certain issues that are going on within the society. So they make laws based on that, and it's the monarch who approves this law. Now let's move on to another type of delegated legislation. We have statutory instruments. Again, this is a type of legislation that occurs only in a constitutional monarchy. It is a form of legislation that allows government ministers and other authorized entities to make, amend, or revoke detailed legal provisions without the need for a new act of parliament. It is a form of legislation specific to the UK and other constitutional monarchies such as Australia and Canada. So remember, they do not have a written constitution, so they have to be making laws that adapt to changing situations in their society, and the statutory instrument is what helps them to do that. Now let's move on to another type of delegated legislation. We have provisional order. So this is a type of delegated legislation that is initially issued by a government minister or department, but must be confirmed by an act of parliament to become law. Provisional orders have a temporary effect until they are confirmed by parliament. If they are not confirmed, they lapse and do not become permanent law. So this is one of the laws that are made by government ministers. It happens here in this country. Ministers make certain laws and they have to submit it to the parliament for them to review it. If they do not confirm this law, it lapses, it doesn't become permanent law. Now let's move on to another type. All right, we have special procedure order. So this order is made by government ministers. When creating a special procedure order, the minister responsible must lay it before the parliament, who confirms this order after 14 days, unless petitions of a general objection have been lodged against it. So within 40 days, the legislature has to approve this order in order for it to become law. However, if citizens of the country do not agree with this particular order, they can make petitions against it and it can be repealed. All right, so let's move on to another type of delegated legislation. So we have rules. These are specific detailed ethics and guidelines guiding the activities of every member of a professional body, e.g. the Nigerian Medical Association and the Nigerian Bar Association. They dictate the day-to-day operation of these bodies. So these rules are constitutionally legal and must be adhered to. So we are talking about the rules that guide certain professional bodies, that guide how they act within that body, like what they should do, what they should not do. And these laws have constitutional backing. It is constitutionally legal. And if you do not abide by these rules, there will be penalty for your actions. All right, now let's move on to the next slide. So we're going to discuss the merits of delegated legislation. One of the merits is efficiency and speed. Delegated legislation allows for a faster legislative process than passing an act of parliament. It can respond quickly to urgent situations and changing circumstances. Again, the lawmakers cannot make laws, cannot make legislation for everything that is going on within the society. So they need the assistance of these ministries, of these public corporations to make laws that help to respond quickly to changing circumstances. Then we also have expertise and specialization. Delegated legislation is often used to fill in detailed and technical aspects of primary legislation. So experts in specific fields can draft regulations that is tailored to specific industries or sectors. So these ministries, these corporations, they have expertise, they have specialization on how the regulations, the law should work. So they can draft a particular law, they can draft a regulation for the approval, for the final approval of the lawmakers. So this helps to make sure that the laws that are made are tailored to the specific industries or sectors for which the regulations, the laws will be passed on. Then we also have reduction of workload. By delegating legislative powers, Parliament can focus on more significant issues and broader policy matters, leaving detailed rulemaking to relevant experts and authorities. It helps to reduce the workload of members of the Parliament or the legislature. Then we also have local and sectoral relevance. Delegated legislation can be crafted to address local conditions or specific sectors. So this provides for a more relevant and effective regulation. We talked about how the local governments also need laws that are specific to their particular situation. With delegated legislation, this is made possible. It has local and sectoral relevance. Now let's move on to the demerits of delegated legislation. One of the demerits is democratic consent. Delegated legislation is made by individuals or bodies that are not directly elected, which can raise concerns about democratic legitimacy and accountability. Members of these ministries, these public corporations, they are not elected by the people. You did not elect them to make laws for you, but yet they are given power to make laws within the society. So this is a demerit of delegated legislation. Then we also have proliferation of rules. The volume of delegated legislation can lead to a complex and sometimes confusing legal landscape. This makes it difficult for individuals and businesses to keep track of all applicable rules. So, for example, if you want to create a new business in a particular society, you need to be aware of all the different rules that have been made by different ministries, different bodies within the society. And if you are not aware of all of these rules, you can be breaking a rule that you're not aware of. And this can lead to jail time, it can lead to penalty. So it's a problem in a society where there are a lot of legislation made not by the lawmakers but by other bodies that have been delegated to make these laws. Then we also have growth in executive powers. So when power is constantly delegated to the executive, it can lead to the executive having too much power, which violates the principle of separation of power. So the legislature is meant to make the law. The executive is just meant to enforce it. But now that the legislature is delegating some lawmaking powers to the executive, it undermines the principle of separation of power. The separation of power is meant to ensure that there is no abuse of power by any one arm or branch of government. But without this separation, there is going to be a problem within the society. So this is another demerit of delegated legislation. Then we also have abuse of power. Without sufficient checks and balances, delegated authorities may implement regulations that go beyond the intended scope or purpose of the primary legislation. Sometimes the lawmakers may not check on the activities of this executive that they've delegated power to. They might make laws that have not been confirmed or approved by the legislature. So this can lead to abuse of power. They can make laws that abuse the fundamental rights of the citizens and that suit their own self-interest. Then we have lack of public awareness. The numerous bylaws, rules, and regulations may not be known to the common citizens because they are not well publicized. So the citizens of a country may not be aware of so many laws that are made by these different bodies, individuals, and ministries. And so they may not be able to keep track of it. They might commit a crime, but they may not know it was a crime because they are not aware of the various laws that are made by these various organizations. So this can be a problem. It can be a demerit for delegated legislation. So we've come to the end of this segment of the video lesson. I believe it was educative and enlightening. So if you'd like to continue with us, please go down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website. There you can subscribe for the government topic by topic video lesson. So when you've done that, we can move on to how delegated legislation can be controlled. We're also going to discuss the various processes of legislation, and then we're going to discuss the concept of lobbying, which is a very important concept in government. So I hope to see you there. I believe you're enjoying this content. If yes, please do not forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release the next videos.